It's not been a great couple of weeks for Germany. You may have heard the news that Russia managed to spy on a secret conversation between some high-ranking military officers and published the information on the internet for all to hear. So, what exactly happened and how damaging is it? But first, let's talk about the subject of this meeting. For a couple of months, the German government had been discussing the possibility of supplying Ukraine with long-range missiles to help in its war against Russia, specifically the Taurus KEPD-350. This is a cruise missile developed jointly by Germany and Sweden and currently in use by the armed forces in Germany, Spain and South Korea. A cruise missile is a type of guided missile that flies long distances at a constant speed until it reaches its target. The Taurus is launched from an airplane, has a range of up to 500 kilometers, and flies at very low altitude to make it harder for the enemy to shoot down. Ultimately, Chancellor Scholz decided against supplying it to the Ukraine, contrary to the wishes of some of his own ministers. One of the reasons that he gave for this was that it would risk dragging Germany into the war and making it a target for Russian attacks. Plenty of analysts actually disagree with Scholz on this point, by the way. I am not remotely qualified to comment on this, but given that this conflict does have the potential to escalate into a global war, I can appreciate that this kind of decision is incredibly hard to make. Now, at the time the meeting took place, the government hadn't yet made its final decision. It was already quite clear that the government would probably decide against, but just in case, the Inspector of the Air Force, Lieutenant General Ingo Gerhardt, held a meeting with three other officers to discuss options. The meeting took the form of a video conference. The problem here is that there was pretty much no security at all. The conference was conducted on the WebEx platform, with participants dialing in on unsecured phone lines. The recording makes it clear that one of the participants was in a hotel room in Singapore. WebEx is a commercially available video conferencing suite. The security that it has may well be enough for ordinary business meetings, for example, but is woefully inadequate to deal with this kind of thing. Russian intelligence was essentially able to hack into the system and record the entire conversation. Now, it may be that the officers let their guard down because they weren't discussing anything that was dreadfully top secret. Mostly they were discussing how to brief the defense minister should the chancellor drop his opposition to the idea. One of the things they covered was whether the Ukrainians would be able to operate the system without the help of Germans. And this is where I had to do a bit of digging, because it turns out that it's not quite as simple as you might imagine. It's easy to think that with today's sophisticated technology, all anyone needs to do is to type in the coordinates and the missile just automatically flies there. That is half right, but apparently it is more complicated than that. Remember how I said that the Taurus missile flies at low altitudes? According to one article I read, this means that it has to be programmed with a detailed 3D map of the terrain. It has to know the location of every hill, tree and electricity pylon. It's even more sophisticated than that, but basically the questions that the officers were discussing were along the lines of how long would it take to train Ukrainians to use the system, and would programming it require the active participation of the German military? The other major topic they discussed was more important. What could Taurus actually achieve? Which targets would be within its range? In particular, they discussed whether it could be used to take out the bridge that the Russians built to access the Crimean Peninsula, which they annexed 10 years ago. Not exactly the kind of information that James Bond would risk his life for, but Russian intelligence recorded the whole thing and apparently handed the recording to the editor-in-chief of Russia Today, who published extracts of it on Telegram. German intelligence is pretty sure that the recording is genuine, although it can't rule out the possibility that it might have been manipulated in some way. However, it is certain that there was a leak, and there's no dispute over what was discussed. Aside from being profoundly embarrassing for the German government, this does reveal a very huge security hole. Why was this confidential meeting held on an insecure commercial platform? how many more confidential meetings have the Russians been listening into? Perhaps even more damaging, at least in the short term, is the massive propaganda victory that Russia has just been given. The German Chancellor was worried about Germany being seen as a legitimate military target. Well, that's actually happening. What was in fact a discussion about what to tell the defense minister about what Taurus was capable of is being used as evidence that Germany is planning military strikes against Russia and is therefore participating in the war. I don't think this means that Russia is about to attack Germany or even that we are heading towards World War III. But it is a very good illustration of how a simple lapse of judgment can have very serious consequences. Germany into the war and making it a target for making it a target for Russian attacks, dragging Germany into the war.